to Dialogue Conspiracy. That's a long time. 78 hours of programs on 78 different weekends.
You know, it sounds so funny when you say it. An hour a week for a year and a half.
It's a long time. Long time. There are a lot of late-breaking stories. The Watergate story breaks so quickly that, well, it's hard to know whether you're on top of the latest developments. But some developments this past week concerning John Schmitz and some people that have surfaced in front of him and in front of the nation concerning the Arthur Bremer affair and the attempted assassination of George Wallace. And there is, like we said, the Watergate affair. Developments concerning campaign contributions to the Republican re-election effort.
No, I don't like the word Watergate caper because it's the cover story for something which is very... But
the tone
of that column back east, syndicated column. Do you know where she comes from, Robin Adair Smith? Do you know what city?
No, I don't.
We're getting letters.
Robin Adam Sloan.
Adam Sloan. I'm almost right.
Where'd you get that name, Robin Adair Smith? That must be Freudian or something.
I don't know. I'm tired. I've been working all week. We're up in San Francisco. I did 2 radio shows that are really good, and one was from 10 to 2:30, KSFX, and the other one was KSAN,
KSAN. Our friends at KSAN.
Going out to the city, reaching out with the information from Carmel up there.
What kind of reaction did you have from people up in the city?
Really good. They were buying realists at the City Lights up there at the bookstore. They've sold 500 copies already of the realist in 2 weeks, 3 weeks. The Thunderbird now has the realist. If the listeners want to go in there, there's a 3-part article that I have on my research on the Watergate Hotel and on how Richard Nixon came to power and the American Assassin. They're all related. There's a linear connection going between all of them. And
I'd ask you to explain, but that would take the whole hour.
Whole hour.
So I'll get you on something else. You should mention how the Robin Adam Sloan came out, because we just threw that out at the beginning of this program. There was a column. It's a question and answer column published by a syndicated columnist called by the name of Robin Adam Sloan, and the column apparently is called Personalities Plus. And somebody wrote from a PL in Carmel, California, wrote asking if she knew anything about a woman who broadcast a program called Dialogue Assassination, which has since been changed to Dialogue Conspiracy. That's dated somewhat. And the person PL in Carmel says, "Is she a nut or what?"
And what was the answer?
The answer was, you're talking about Mae Brussell, who was a housewife with 5 kids when President Kennedy was assassinated in '63, and it goes on to describe various efforts you have, and said the program is on KLRB in Carmel, and she is starting a periodical called Conspiracy Newsletter. And the fact that the radio station was mentioned in some of the newspapers in which this was published has prompted us to be the reciprocal for letters. You've got some of them in your hand, from Illinois, Washington, D.C., New Jersey.
Yeah, I got one today from Boston.
Even from as far away as Monterey, California.
Who didn't know? They didn't know about
didn't know the program was on the air.
Yeah, Virginia. I got some at home from Virginia and Boston and Illinois, and they just sent them to Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. And people, with a little bit of exposure, people would get interested in the conspiracy theory we talk about out here on the West Coast, but there's no other city in the United States that has a show like this. So, but the article, The Real, is branching out, and information spreading, hopefully will reach some more states around. The headlines this week were apropos of the title. The article I wrote was Martha Mitchell kidnapped? The story of Martha Mitchell and her kidnapping at the Watergate Hotel. Why was she kidnapped? And a lot of people think that was funny, or I did it in jest, because The Realist is a magazine with cartoons and satire. But the article is very serious, and after you read it, you realize the nature of it, the tone of it. And the implication was that if Martha Mitchell was physically kidnapped, actually injured and kidnapped by members of the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon, hired employees of that committee, then it indicated how far a fascist state can go in this country without people even being aware of it. And if they do this to Martha Mitchell, who's part of the game in the system, what would they do to the rest of us? So the article in The Realist, you all can get it at the Thunderbird bookstore. You read it there.
Carmel Valley. What about people that are listening to the Santa Cruz area?
The bookstore in Santa Cruz has it. There's a bookstore in Santa Cruz that carries The Realist.
You know which one? There's Bookshop Santa Cruz? Bookshop Santa Cruz in the Pacific Avenue Garden Mall.
And it was Thursday's paper about the Chronicle and the San Jose Mercury, Monterey Herald, all had articles about Martha Mitchell and her treatment, that she recognized the guard who knocked her down at the hotel. She was staying in California at Newport Beach the weekend of June 17th. And that weekend, she was calling on the telephone to tell somebody, Helen Thomas from UPI, something that she heard at the Watergate Hotel. And the guard took the telephone and yanked it from the wall and went in her daughter's bedroom. Her daughter's 12 years old, and yanked that phone from the wall. And he knocked her, she said, through the window. The guard, his name is Mr. King, and she says that Steve King, and she says that he knocked her through a plate glass window. And she identified the man who did all this, and he held her down while she got an injection. Against her wishes, she said very clearly, against my wishes. They threw me down, and they kicked me. With his rubber shoes, he kicked me, and she had 6 stitches in her middle finger and 5 stitches on her ring finger. And her fingers are still stiff and may be permanently stiff, and her wedding ring doesn't fit. My little sweetheart, as Mitchell referred to her, got her wedding ring finger smashed by his security guard. And she was kept prisoner for 24 hours. She couldn't see anybody or have any food. Her daughter was taken out for food, and then the attendant that was taking care of her daughter disappeared with the particular agent who knocked her down, did all the kicking. Martha Mitchell said it was the most bizarre thing. It was worse than the Watergate affair. Well, if Richard Nixon asked the Democrats not to open up a lawsuit about the Watergate affair until after his election because it would damage his campaign. So you can imagine if the Martha Mitchell thing is worse than the Watergate. And it is worse because at the Watergate, you have 5 men arrested planting bugging devices and taking pictures of personal documents or Democratic Party documents and picking up conversations and maybe using them for blackmail or planting evidence against them. That's serious. But on the other hand, you have Martha Mitchell, the wife of the ex-attorney general who left that job to be the head of the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon. You have her in a hotel room, and she's out in California, and it's the night that the robbery broke through, the breakthrough at the Watergate, and one of the men arrested was employed by her husband in the committee, James McCord. Now, she says that when she called for help and realized something was happening, John Mitchell wasn't around. He wasn't around for 24 hours. So in my article in The Realist, I talk about the fact that Patrick Gray III, the acting head of the FBI, was staying at the same hotel as John Mitchell, and both denied that they knew the other one was staying there. But if John Mitchell didn't visit with Patrick Gray, and he wasn't with his wife, where was he at the time for 24 hours? Does he usually stay away 24 hours on a resort vacation? So if this man is lying as the head of the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon, and the new acting head of the FBI, I also mentioned, I keep referring to the Realist article, how Patrick Gray shouldn't be allowed to be the head of the FBI. He doesn't investigate anything, he closes the investigation. So that man was with John Mitchell at the time the other men employed by Mitchell's committee were arrested. And Martha Mitchell didn't see her husband 24 hours, and then we don't know how she ended up in New York. But she was actually kidnapped, and the title of my article, it was completed June the 13th, and this is already September, and it was just September the 14th. July 13th was when I finished it, 2 months later. She called the press, the Washington Star, because she wanted them to know that she's not an alcoholic or a mental patient. That is the system of putting down a person who knows too much, like Dita Beard. I said she's getting the Dita Beard treatment. It is. They're trying to discredit her. She said she's not alcoholic and she's not a mental patient. And the only reason she spoke up now, she said, I've kept my silence. But the only reason she spoke up now is that somebody sent an article to Parade, the magazine section of the newspaper, and asked about Steve King, the new head of the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon, head of the security for that committee. And the article implied that he was not involved with Martha Mitchell's Watergate caper or affair. And she called the Washington Star and said, yes, that he is the same man that knocked her down and caused her to have a shot in the behind. We don't know what fluid it was and when she ended up in New York, but she was actually kidnapped. And the intent of my article, even though it's in a funny magazine, a magazine filled with satire, is a serious article of how a police state can operate when somebody has seen too much, and she got the treatment. So we'll go on. One of the things I want to talk about, which worries me, is the War Council. We'll go back to the Watergate in a minute, but I call it the War Council. I've talked about a lot of things in the last 70 weeks or so, a year and a half, and made a lot of predictions about people being shot on the eve of their primary, like Wallace was shot, and we'll go to the Wallace thing in a minute. I made a lot of predictions, and I feel very uneasy about the signs in the news. A friend of mine called me this week and said, is there any good news? Tell us what we can do. Tell us about the good news. I wish I could.
People always ask me the same thing.
You want the good news?
Yeah, I never have any good news. I don't know what to tell them.
Well, I don't know what the things that worry me are this. Richard Nixon wants to be elected the President of the United States, and the powers that be have set him into that position and assume that he's going to look after their interests the next 4 years. They really don't want George McGovern. There's a certain set of war machine makers, industrialists, and international oil people that have selected Richard Nixon as the man to represent them, and they have a very mean campaign against George McGovern to put him down, discredit him, try to break his thing apart.
And they're the War Council?
The War Council. We're going to have another meeting of a War Council. Did you see the newscast? There's going to be at John Conley's ranch again, and the War Council is going to meet one more time, and I talked about that before on another show before, some heavy things.
No, they aren't actually called the War Council. That's the name you've given them, isn't it?
I give them the name the War Council. Let's talk about the signs that Richard Nixon's getting ready to move for something. I'm going to talk about the past meeting of the War Council, and I'm going to talk about what happened after they met. Richard Nixon is caught now. His committee is completely shattered. It looks good on the outside. John Mitchell's resigned. H. Gordon Liddy, the attorney from the White House staff that worked with Howard Hunt of the White House, is under arrest. The operation that they were involved in is locked up in the banking books temporarily now. As of April the 7th, we don't have to see any money they had before, but that $10 million fund is sitting there, that $10 million secret fund, always on their mind, that through some legal technicality they may have to subpoena or call that. Richard Nixon has Patrick Gray, the acting head of the FBI. He has no head of the FBI. He has Mr. Abrams as the head of the Pentagon. General Abrams, he's not appointed yet because of the Lavelle bombings. Hundreds of people knew that our country was bombing North Vietnam at the time we had the peace treaty going on, Paris peace talks. We assured North Vietnam we weren't bombing. A man was doing it on his own, and everyone else was covering it. And General Lavelle, at the hearings this week, said General Abrams knew I was bombing. And Abrams says he didn't. And the Congressional Committee said I didn't expect both of them to tell the same story. We don't have a head of the Pentagon. We don't have a head of the FBI.
Well, head of the Joint Chiefs, right?
Joint Chiefs, yeah. We don't have the head of the Joint Chiefs. We don't have a head of the FBI. We only have these temporary people. And we have Mr. Klein that's in the Justice Department, who is suspect, watched all the time because of the ITT thing and his other positions.
So there's a displeasure with the situation?
And Maurice Stans, the Secretary of Commerce, is named in a criminal suit. It's a civil suit, a criminal suit, for his involvement in the financing and funding of the Watergate.
So can you look into a crystal ball and see what this War Council is going to do when they meet?
Well, without these
so-called War Council?
Without these heads of states going and watching the history board like a chessboard, the way they move, I see 5 things which I don't like because I don't think Nixon has anywhere to go. I don't think this Watergate can go too far. There was an article in the, it was a paper in New York City, I'll think of it in a minute, that Mr.
There aren't many left.
Mr. Greenwich, the Village Voice.
Village Voice, okay.
Yeah, Mr. Gonzalez from the locksmith shop is back down in Miami, and he was interviewed about his position in the locksmith shop and his arrest at the Watergate, and they said, how come you're down here now? He said, I've been assured there'll be no trial. Bernard Barker's back down in Miami, business as usual. And I think of these 5 signs that worry me as of this week. One is that Henry Kissinger, the big man all along, is very quiet. He's moving back and forth, Russia, China, nothing specific, staying out of the headlines, making deals like mad. Boeing airplanes going to China, Pepsi-Cola to Russia, wheat to China, wheat to Russia. What can we do for you? And I worry because last year, or a year and a half ago, China and Russia both came out with articles on the Kennedy assassinations. Mao Zedong had an article passed through Mexico. The truth hasn't been told about the Kennedy assassinations. Sputnik, the Soviet Union, printed articles about Lyndon Johnson and the involvement of the government in killing Kennedy. And I felt at that time those were the blackmail or the hold they had on our government to not use atomic bombs in Asia. But if they could make a deal on trade, back and forth, they may give Vietnam to Nixon to play around with to save face. The atomic fleet is moving in there this week. There's atomic warheads moving in. Kissinger's moving around. The intelligence reports this week said that if the war went on, it would go 2 more years. There'd be too much unrest in this country, stretching this thing out with a prisoner of wars. And if we go 2 years, we'll lose the war. We're not going to go 2 more years to lose because we're losing it now. And the Vietnamese wouldn't give Richard Nixon the one thing he needed to win the election, which was peace. You know, they have escalated instead of bowing down, because if he could say he was the man who got the peace for the country, his election campaign would be much stronger. He hoped to have it. And Nixon is not beyond using atomic bombs over there if he wants. And they're using everything else but. And I'm really afraid, and I've read some things out of Europe in different journals, and the way the ships are moving in and Kissinger's moving in, and our domestic scene is falling apart, I'm really worried about. Now, Charles Colson, last week I read a memo at the White House, remember? And I wondered what it was about elections. He's the top aide at the White House and the liaison.
Wants his staff to work 24 hours a day.
That's right. He's the liaison of the CIA and the far right wing to Richard Nixon. He said, elections 71 days away. A day is 24 hours, 7 days a week. You're not to leave your desk or place unless I know where you are. You're either reached by phone or page. You're not to take any time off. You're to go nowhere without telling me. You can't speak without telling me. And he was a very stern list of orders. And at the time I questioned, remember, Phil, is this the way you run an election? He said, maybe on a Sunday, you might have a Sunday off. So I wonder if the war would escalate on Sunday if the day Sunday had a meaning in the message of Colson. He's tied in with Premier Key and the far right wing, you know.
Colson's tied in with Key.
Oh yeah, the CIA and he helped arrange with Carl McIntyre to bring Premier Key from Vietnam over here, and then the citizens protested so much at Premier Key that he was disinvited. But
so what is this War Council going to do when they finally meet?
I don't know. I hope.
So-called War Council. They're going to.
I give them the name War Council. Those are the powers that be. And I got the idea from that book, Penn Jones' book, Forgive My Grief, and he describes. It's volume 3 of that book. He describes the meeting at the home of Clint Murchison, the oilman, and J. Edgar Hoover and Richard Nixon, November 22nd, 1963. And he said they met for final plans for the assassination the next morning of John Kennedy, that it was the most important decision for the United States of America besides the Normandy invasion. I don't like to repeat, on these shows, I've tried to keep them always different, but I've mentioned this about 2 different times. I mentioned it once. I read it in lieu of Nixon being in Dallas the morning of the assassination, the night before. And I repeated it once before in May of this year when there was a barbecue at John Connolly's ranch. And I said to my radio listeners, now, this is pretty heavy. The guest list isn't published, but President Nixon, President Johnson, and John Connally are meeting down there. And I could just see some pretty heavy things could come out of that meeting at that particular time, because you have to know how busy they are and what's going on, that they should come down at that time. Well, a few days later, after their barbecue down there, I think it was a matter of 2 or 3 days, J. Edgar Hoover was dead. He was found dead at his home in the morning when the maid came to work, completely unattended, although the FBI were supposed to have, besides the armored car, around-the-clock guards. No one was there. He was unattended, and no autopsy. He was removed and buried. A few days later than that, on May the 12th, Patrick Gray III, 9 days later, was appointed acting head of the FBI. He is a Nixon man who gave up a job as an officer in the Marines. He went to Annapolis to run Nixon's campaign in 1960. He's been very friendly with Richard Nixon's political career since he left Annapolis, and all of a sudden, from nowhere, no one's heard of him. He's never been in the FBI building in his life. He walks in, he said, he didn't know how many departments or anything. He says, now I'll take over. There's going to be a lot of changes. And that was on May the 12th. On May the 16th, George Wallace was shot. And we'll go back after I finish this little bit on the War Council to show the kind of investigation that Patrick Gray does of the Wallace murder, and certainly no investigation of J. Edgar Hoover's death.
Attempted Wallace murder.
Attempted. Oh, I'm sorry. I just put him there as one of the cases that's researched. I keep forgetting, it's terrible, that he lived, because I think of Bremer as an assassin, as the alleged or would-be assassin. So on the ranch barbecue was the weekend of May the 1st, and on the 3rd, J. Edgar Hoover was dead, and on the May 12th, Gray was the head of the FBI, and the May 16th, the George Wallace was shot, which was a flagrant conspiracy that was never investigated. And then the next day, on May the 17th, John Connally resigned as Secretary of the Treasury, which was an important job. You see, they're realigning the power. Mitchell stepped down, Connally stepped down. Connally then began traveling all over the world with messages for various oil companies. And this is why I think the power is Secretary Rogers, Secretary of State Rogers, and John Connally and Ronald Reagan were sent all around the various embassies where we can't send memos anymore. You know, it's by diplomatic pouch.
Did you say when this War Council meeting is?
Well, this new barbecue was in the paper today. I think it's going to be, it was in the paper Thursday, sometime this week. I don't remember the date. This next weekend or the weekend after. That
so
Nixon and Connally are going down to Texas and have a meeting. And it has to be a serious meeting, because we'll go back to the funding of the Watergate in a few minutes. In the article I mentioned the funding probably going to the Bank of Bernard Barker could come from the city of Houston, Texas, where the CIA funded a lot of money to kill John Kennedy. And just by coincidence, the money in Bernard Barker's bank came from Houston, Texas. See, I wrote that in July. The cutoff date was July 13th. And posed the question, have you looked in Houston, because that would be a good bank location.
I remember you asking that question, saying that Texas seemed to be a good source of money.
So we'll do that story in detail about the banking and the financing, but and I want to go into Patrick Gray a minute because of this newsletter you had over the wire service this week. But at the time that Wallace was shot on June the 1st, from Gutenberg, Germany. There's a conspiracy newsletter put out by Joe Justine, and he said the shooting of George Wallace was nothing but the eye-catching prelude to a far more important act of devilry planned by the CIA to save the Nixon maladministration from disaster. Now that was June the 1st, before the Watergate even exposed them. It was a diversionary maneuver, Justine said, of wide scope, designed to throw off the American public in advance, so they won't recognize the hallmarks of the second coup d'etat now in the making. Joe Justine is a man from Germany who saw the rise of Hitler, left when Hitler came to power and came back later, who came right to Dallas after Kennedy was killed and wrote the very first book on the assassination called Oswald, Assassin or Fall Guy. And he's written 6 books on the Kennedy assassinations, and he writes continuous books on, doing one on Chappaquiddick and Ted Kennedy's accident, and he's done a book on Lyndon Johnson and Marina Oswald, and one on Robert Kennedy. So he talks about Wallace's shooting as just a planned accident. The intent was to kill Wallace, but it's just a preview of what was to come. So this was in June, that he felt by fall, if there was any chance, that Nixon would lose, that we were going to have this second big coup. And that was June the 1st that he wrote that. And June the 17th was the break-in at the Watergate Hotel. And then I wrote my article, which went to print 3 weeks later, that this was the team that could overthrow the country, that could do the coup d'etat that Justine was talking about. That news thing on Bremer, what was that on your wire service this week?
I still have that.
The one on Arthur Bremer?
Let's see here. There it is.
Oh, yeah.
We're organized, folks. Bear with us. Well, you want me to read through this? Okay.
Well, the part that's interesting.
From UPI, United Press International. The presidential candidate of the American Independent Party charges that there is a conspiracy of silence surrounding the government's investigation of Arthur Bremer and the shooting of Governor George Wallace. John Schmitz, the outgoing Republican congressman from California, has demanded a congressional inquiry into the case. Schmitz told a news conference that he has asked the House Internal Security Committee to investigate allegations in a magazine article that there was a communist conspiracy to kill the Alabama governor, and the CIA might also be involved. Schmitz said, and we quote here, "I charge that there has been a conspiracy of silence regarding the evidence showing the repeated association of Bremer with communists and revolutionary militants in Milwaukee." End quote. Schmitz was flanked at the conference by Alan Stang, S-T-A-N-G, author of the article in the October issue of American Opinion, and Timothy Heinan, H-E-I-N-A-N, who said he was an undercover operative for the Milwaukee Police Department while attending Marquette University from 1968 through June 1970. Stang said in the article that his own investigation of the Wallace shooting showed it was a communist conspiracy. Stang added, it could well involve agents of Communist China, and the Central Intelligence Agency might have had something to do with it. Schmitz stopped short of outright endorsement of Stang's conclusions, but said he would put the entire article in the Congressional Record, and said he wanted the committee to investigate Stang's findings.
Maybe we should put the Watergate about the tax allegations in the Congressional Record. This is an interesting thing how the Birch Society works. I take the American Opinion, and they come up with a certain amount of information, but if you lead them to new information, they block out and won't pursue it. In other words, Patrick Gray III is the acting head of the FBI, and he is a very arch-conservative, law and order, violently anti-communist gentleman. And he was in on the arrest. Arthur Bremer went to the hospital with some stitches, and they called the White House, is it all right? And they said, yes, if he's under the control of the FBI. So the FBI took over, and the local Maryland police were simply furious that they didn't get a chance to take care of that case. And the FBI covered it up. We've talked about this in other shows. So if communists were involved with Arthur Bremer and Patrick Gray hides them, then Patrick Gray is hiding communists. The Birch Society should ask for the removal of Patrick Gray if he isn't doing an investigation. Now, I believe that there is a conspiracy of silence. I agree with this particular press conference and his information. I believe there should be a congressional inquiry into the shooting of Wallace. I think the internal security group can look into the allegations that he went to 3 communist meetings, but they should also look into the fact of he stayed at the Waldorf Astoria, or he stayed at the Lord Elgin, where a CIA agent was at the time he was in Canada. There are 2 researchers in Dallas that have worked on the John Kennedy murder for 9 years or 8 years, and they're arch-conservatives. They're members of the Birch Society. Her name's Mary Farrell, and the other is Arch Kimbrough. Kimbrough is a graduate of West Point. And they started working years ago for all the communist leads. That Oswald went to the communist meetings, that Oswald was a member of the Communist Party, or he took communist subscriptions. And they were determined, for the sake of America, to find everything that mentioned Oswald's CIA, communist, not the CIA, the Communist Association. And the reason they've never published an article, or you've never known about those two people, and they have a whole wing of a house like a computer operation, card files on witnesses that were before the commission. The reason you never hear from those people is they couldn't find one communist. And mostly they found CIA or FBI involved. And so they can't use their work. They're not about to tell you, you see, and they work and collect information. Now, Arthur Bremer may have gone to 3 communist offices before he was hired to shoot Wallace. But the money didn't come from the communists. It's just to lose the traces. They did this with Oswald. And the point, I wish once and for all that they would work for a full congressional opening of this thing and get all the evidence out. But that would be impossible. It would go back again to the same cycle. There's no way.
Okay, we're sort of at a halfway break here. With political research specialist Mae Brussell.
Should we go back a little bit to the Watergate news this week? Because it's so important.
We want to repeat that, Mae, because I think the orchestra...
the music's there?
The boys in the band were a little loud there.
Okay. I keep going back to the news of the Watergate Hotel because I know that people who just pick up this show are probably wondering, we're jumping around a little bit today. I always want to get back to the Watergate because the culmination of all my research on political assassinations can be visualized if you follow the newspaper articles of what's happening at the trial or the cases that are going to come up there. Because even with a tight lid on all the information coming out, you get a peek at the espionage establishment, the way it operates. And in that article that I did on The Realist on Martha Mitchell and why she was kidnapped, I said that if you follow this, if you follow the case very closely, you get a real view of how two governments exist side by side. What I put in there was that the CIA is not new at altering the choice of candidates or presidents. Innocent people believe that the electors have a choice of candidates through primaries or direct voting. And the same CIA that killed Kennedy because he won the majority of votes eliminated opposition to Richard Nixon in every election since Kennedy's death. Murders, accidents, attempted murders through the use of hired killers, planted patsies, and news coverage concealed the crime. Then I went on to say 2 governments exist side by side, one visible and one invisible. As the power structure gets more arrogant and sure of itself, the invisible becomes more clear and overt. And if the truth were told about the Wallace shooting and Arthur Bremer, if it's told about them, and if the Watergate affair is exposed, just those 2, you would see how the invisible government agents go about their daily business. And this is, I'm reading from The Realist right now, it says, if the Democratic Party has the courage, or if it is allowed to follow through with this suit, you will find the most fantastic duel in American political history. Now, I go to an article this week that was in the paper about the financing, which may seem complicated to a lot of people, but I outlined it and charted it.
It's easier to understand on paper than it is to hear it.
It is? Really?
I think when you've got it in front of you, it's hard enough seeing it in a newspaper article, but it's a little easier in a chart. But listening to it, it sounds like the Art Buchwald column.
Oh, really? Well,
that we read last week was funny because it went on and on and on and on and on. But this is deadly.
Well, if you take an article, what I mean by making diagrams, I make a linear connection of the subjects in the article and branch them out. And
let's see how well you can do by trying it over the radio and see whether people can follow. Maybe if they have a pencil and paper.
Okay, I'm taking...
If you're listening now, get out your pencil and paper. We'll have a quiz
afterwards. We've done this before. I did this with several things. I'm taking an article that
multiple choice quiz following this, so take good notes.
Okay, San Jose Mercury.
No, you don't have to take the quiz.
No, I'm going to give the quiz.
You're going to give it.
You're going to take it when it's over.
Oh, brother.
Okay, there was a large article, Texan links stands with Mexico cash.
Okay, do we put stands at the top of the page now?
Okay, you put okay, we're going to go, and there's another Monterey Herald article that was report links Mexico money to Watergate bugging. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to try to describe how you finance a clandestine operation, because
it's kind of a do-it-yourself thing. Huh?
I maintain that
hope nobody takes you up on this and tries it out, see if it works.
Okay, let them get their pencil now.
Okay, pencil and paper ready. We're starting in A4.
Espionage agency financing. Okay, Bernard Barker, a member of the CIA, a conduit of funds for the Bay of Pigs operation, was arrested at the Watergate Hotel June 17th. That goes to the top of your chart.
We're working backwards.
We're going to go right and left.
Oh,
now, don't confuse this.
Okay.
Backwards, I'd be off the paper. We're going Bernard Barker. He lives in Miami. He was arrested at the Watergate Hotel. He had $5,600 in his pocket at the time of consecutive $100 bills. That's why they could trace this other money. If he went without the cash, they wouldn't know where these men were funded from. But he had money. The same man who was carrying cash on him was the conduit of funds for the Bay of Pig operation in 1961. Now, Bernard Barker had a bank account in Miami Beach where he had a deposit of $89,000 and another deposit of $25,000 that we went into last week on the show from Andreas from Minneapolis, who got a bank charter right after he gave the money to Richard Nixon.
Confusing the chart.
Okay. Now, in his bank in Miami, he had $89,000.
Okay.
Plus
$89,000 in the bank in Miami plus $25,000.
Okay. The $25,000 came from Andreas in Minneapolis, and $89,000 came from the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon, and it came in the form, I'll show you how it got into the bank, but it originally came in 4 notes from Mexico. Now, that's Bernard Barker. He had the money in his bank.
Okay.
Now, when he was caught with $89,000 from a Mexican bank to Miami, the first story was that he had clients, real estate clients in Mexico City that he was working with, and it was a refund for those clients. When he was first arrested and the money was discovered, this was money from a real estate transaction.
Okay.
And he's in real estate transactions.
Because it was pretty evident that it had come from Mexico, so that was the cover story.
Bernard Barker also travels around Latin America doing real estate transactions, in quotes, with Howard Hunt, who was with the CIA 21 years. At the time, Hunt was doing real estate transactions in Honduras and Nicaragua with Barker. He was still CIA. Barker was CIA. Okay. Now, he has $89,000 in his bank in Miami. How did he get it? Well, the Pennzoil Corporation, a Mr. Lidke, the president, said, I know of and approved of the complex plans of the transferred money. There was a sum of $700,000 that went from Texas to Mexico and back to Houston, Texas. And they did it. It was money raised for the Republican committee, $700,000, that went from Houston, Texas
to Mexico and back.
And then sent back. And they did it to make it appear that the money came from Mexico. It really came from Houston, but it was sent to Mexico to make it look like it came from Mexico, so that that Mexicans had donated this money and not people in the Southwest. Now, this is washing espionage money.
This was re-election money?
Yeah, well,
Isn't it illegal for an alien, a foreign alien, to contribute money to a political campaign?
It's only illegal if you're caught.
Famous
Okay.
First and last words.
If the Scotch tape weren't over the door at the Watergate Hotel, it wouldn't have been illegal because a lot of foreign money.
Okay, but I mean, there is a law in the books that says that aliens, foreign aliens, can't contribate money to campaigns.
Well, Mr. Pappas of the Pappas Foundation comes over from Greece and tells Richard Nixon, you're to take Agnew as your vice president. Our aliens, he lives there all the time, just about our aliens choosing our vice presidents for us. I thought at the time that was bad, and I've been talking about it for 4 years. Okay, so the money...
But the money then must have, on the surface, come from Americans residing in Mexico then.
No, Americans in Houston who sent it to Mexico, so in return looking like it came from Mexico.
But it would have to have come from an American in Mexico to return looking like it came from...
But except they didn't. It was still there was some consecutive money there, which later is described as CIA money. It's interesting if it came from contributions that they were in chronological order, all new dollars. You see, now we're going to, let's get off. A messenger arrived from Mexico City on April the 5th. April the 7th was the cutoff day decided by the attorney for the Nixon committee, G. Gordon Liddy, that from after the 7th they'd have to announce where their money came from. But this money came on April the 5th to the Pennzoil office in Houston, Texas, and there was $100,000, $89,000 in checks, and $11,000 in $100 bills. $11,000 in $100 bills, $89,000 in check. And the office it came from was Emmanuel de Guerre, a Mexican attorney, who's the lawyer for the Houston, Texas oil company that heads the fundraising of Richard Nixon. So you've got the fundraiser at the oil company in Houston. Now, the man who delivered the money, the messenger from Mexico, said to the Houston office, "I don't ask for a receipt for the money." That in the fundraising business, you never deal with receipts.
I thought he asked for one.
No.
And he was told that they don't deal in receipts.
Oh, maybe that was it. There was no receipt. There was no verification.
I think he wanted one, but he ended up leaving without one.
Okay, it was made clear either way that he gave $89,000 plus $11,000 and no receipt.
No receipt. Okay.
Yeah, this checks and cash. I didn't get a receipt. Now, they took this money and they picked up $600,000 more in checks and securities that they collected around the Southwest, and they rushed it to Washington, D.C. in their own airplane. They had $150,000 in cash and $500,000 in checks and stocks that went within 36 hours before the law clamped down to Washington, D.C., raised by donors in the Southwest that were supposed to be for Richard Nixon, gathered by the executive Pennzoil Company, and it goes to Washington, and it's handed to Hugh Sloan Jr. at the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon. Now, when Hugh Sloan was called in for questioning, he had left the committee already. He left that committee as treasurer because his wife was pregnant, remember? And so Hugh Sloan was to have received that money, and $350,000 of this money, of the cash, which is quite a large amount, $350,000 out of the $700,000, was found in the safe of Maurice Stans, who's the former Secretary of Commerce, well-known lawyer on the East Coast, who also received the money from Andreas from Minneapolis to Miami and back up to the committee. Stans received this money. He's the man who's suing Larry O'Brien, for hassling him, and says the banking committee didn't talk courteously to him. Maurice Stans, in his own personal safe, had $350,000 that wasn't listed in the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon as campaign donations. This is, I hope people will get the article in the Realist that I wrote. If you don't have it already, get the one that's out of the Thunderbird. The ones who have it can appreciate the news coming in each day. If they've read it, they can appreciate the news, because $350,000 ended up in Stan's account, and now $89,000 ended up in Miami in Bernard Berker's account, and he's to be arrested. And the money that he has when he's arrested is consecutively numbered, that matches the money in Miami, that matches the money that was brought in, all consecutive. See, so it had to be printed by the CIA, because down in Miami they were talking about how the CIA operates with those clean numerical $100 bills. And if it was raised by all over the Southwest, it wouldn't have that same appearance. It would be hard to find those all in order. So then Maurice Stans had destroyed, or is supposed to have had destroyed in his office, all record of transactions. Now, anyone who has heard Dialogue Conspiracy knows that many times we talk about one part of the conspiratorial process is the destruction of the evidence. We start with John Kennedy's car, the day he was killed, the lamppost, the street sign, the clothing of John Connally it was dry cleaned and laundered, and the State Department papers of Oswald that were burned by thermofaxing, and postal slips that disappeared. The evidence that hangs around that's loose is destroyed. Maurice Stan's record of how he spent this money or doled it out is missing, and he promised, or somebody said, you won't find it. Now, there's several points about this money. One is that there is a violation of a law if Mexico financed this operation. See?
Or Mexicans.
The Mexicans, yeah. But imagine if Americans in Houston are found with consecutive money that they send to Mexico, then send it back on a plane from Mexico, put in a bag, send it to Washington, and ends up in Miami, and it's financing espionage, clandestine activities in Washington, D.C. So there is a violation of the law. The second thing is that this is clandestine money. It's cash. It's kept cash. Stans doesn't deposit it with the regular committee. They move in cash, and it's useful to go about your business. Now, people say, how do you get away with financing? James Earl Ray, Sirhan, Lee Harvey Oswald.
Where did the money come from? There must be a record somewhere.
There must be a record somewhere. The Warren Commission was very fanatical. They almost told you how much toothpaste Lee Harvey Oswald used per month. I mean, they had such an exacting account of a Coca-Cola or a Hostess cupcake or something. They went really into depth. And then when I read the Warren Commission hearings, I found that Oswald was spending a lot more money, and had a lot more hobbies and did a lot more things than they were talking about. But they thought if they could account for every cent, then he couldn't be an agent, because here's what he earned and here's what he spent. You see, and all this other cash, James Earl Ray went through all kinds of money, and Jack Ruby had money before he died. A lot of money goes into playing a conspiracy, but it shows up in our time right now, this week, and we can take advantage of the news and my research and go over it together and watch how an agency operates and also defends itself in the news media. So you have a violation of a law of the money from Mexico. You have clandestine money, cash locked up in safes. You have consecutive CIA money, and that is an important thing, And then you have the allegation of Louis Tackwood, which briefly I have to go in, where he said that the San Diego conventions would be disrupted with violence, and he was to hire the radicals, and then the convention was moved from San Diego to Miami. And all of this money transaction is the interim of March, April, and May, after the ITT scandal and the funding of Nixon's campaign broke. When they moved the operation, so all the people, they were caught now because they had a new team working. They only had a couple of months to do it before that date clamped down for the money. You see? So all this money transaction all took place.
That might explain why the people who were instrumental in picking the date for the deadline suddenly found that they were barely able to meet the deadline for revealing what money, getting their money in before they would have to reveal the sources.
Exactly. And then they had to be careful, because if they broke the deadline and went over, they had to move it around a few times, you see, and lose its source. That's right. That's exactly what happened. That they had to lose. They were caught because the date they decided to move almost coincided with the date that they'd have to disclose the donors from then on. And if you are hiring a man in October and November for provocations that are going to take place the following summer in San Diego, and you're moving the whole group to the East Coast, you only have a short time to get the money out. You see, Mrs. Barker, Bernard Barker's wife, said, I don't know why he's back in this kind of a business. He hasn't seen the group of anti-Castro Cubans for 5 years. So there was this frantic gathering the money and losing the traces of the money because the cutoff date was the 7th. And if they
Apparently it wasn't lost too well, huh?
No. Now, there was a problem here, a conflict of interest, which I think I wanted to bring up, because the judge that's trying this case in Washington, D.C., the Watergate case, U.S. District Judge Charles Ritchie, is a man appointed by Spiro Agnew. Definite conflict of interest, because every one of the persons arrested belongs to the pro-Agnew as against the Nixon team. And I don't want to go too much into that right now, but the George ordered a case depositions to be stopped until September the 20th. And he said that newspapers were violating rules concerning pretrial publicity. And he denounced news conferences of the New York Times and Bernard Barker, various news conferences. And he said he didn't want any more news conferences on this thing. They carried on in the court, and they shouldn't get so much publicity. Well, right after he said that, after the judge said he didn't want this, which was on the 13th, then Jack Anderson came out and got a news leak. And Jack Anderson spilled the beans. The Wright-Patman and the Senate, the Congress was investigating this Texas money that had been washed and turned around so many times in Mexico, and they have a large document, 58-page report on banking laws that was turned into the House Banking Committee. But Jack Anderson got a hold of a copy of it, and the report was not to be circulated. Chairman Wright-Patman, Democrat of Texas, said no one was to circulate this because of the legal cases going on, and Jack Anderson got a copy and circulated to the Associated Press. Well, Jack Anderson's close friend, Frank Sturgis, was arrested at the Watergate Hotel. And he went down to the court the night that they were arrested and vouched for him and knew him for 20 years, and he was a source of information to Jack Anderson to write his column. Now, Jack Anderson has a buddy who's arrested. And the judges said, I'll have a mistrial if we get any more interviews or newspaper things on this case. Jack Anderson gets a hold of the memo and writes it, which would give his buddy a mistrial. I don't think it's fair for Jack Anderson to blow the case for a man who's fed him material for 20 years. To stand there and blow it. And I talked to people in San Francisco who were calling the Washington McGovern headquarters today and said, get on this in a hurry. And called the judge and tell him, what are you going to do with Jack Anderson? We didn't do it, and that man has a direct interest, a financial interest, because the guy feeds him information. So the friend of Jack Anderson's that I'm talking about, Frank Sturgis, is written up as a part of a militant group that was apprehended at the time that John Kennedy was killed. His name was Frank Angelo Fiorino, alias Edward Hamilton, involved in the Bay of Pigs, a former Marine, a friend of Jack Anderson's, described in Computer and Automation, an anti-Castro Cuban organizer in Miami. And he works with Diaz Lance out of Cuba, a former Castro Air Force chief. He purchased arms for anti-Castro Cuban groups. He was questioned by the FBI about Lee Harvey Oswald being in Miami in '63, as were his other friends from the No Name Key Group. Now, the No Name Key Group is what Jim Garrison refers to in his research and work. They're a group of men that decide to assassinate President Kennedy. This is written in Computer Automation, August 1972. If some of you want to go to the library, MPC, or Navy Postgrad, look this up. But I'm mentioning just Frank Sturgis in conjunction, who he is in conjunction with Jack Anderson, because Anderson could blow the trial and gets all the men off. And one of the 5 men is down in Miami saying, we're not going to have a trial. This was in the Village Voice this week, we're not going to have a trial. So Frank Sturgis was part of the No Name group off Lake Pontchartrain near New Orleans. And this group were training men with CIA backers, and they decided to kill President Kennedy. Clay Shaw, David Ferry, Major L.M. Bloomfield, Jim Braden, Guy Bannister, and other people at the CIA involved, William Seymour, alias Leon Oswald, and so forth. The assassination group was well organized, backed from money from the CIA, had money from Texas right-wing groups, and the planning was complex and detailed and required a concentrated effort, and they were to set up Oswald, their decoy, as the patsy. Now, I'm reading, again, Computer Automation, August 1972. This is Frank Sturgis. One of the 5 men that's arrested is walking around saying, we're not going to have a trial. The judge in Washington is saying, I think I'll call a civil trial off. The federal trial isn't going to be anything. The judge, the investigator from the Justice Department said 2 days ago, we've already completed our investigation. And all this stuff is coming in about Mexico and Martha Mitchell. They're going to do an investigation, the Justice Department, of the Watergate like they did the Arthur Bremer. I knew it. That's when I wrote my article in July. I knew the Justice Department would never investigate the Watergate because their agents are involved and they're there to put the lid on conspiracies and to plan them. They're not there to find them. That's why I wrote about it, the Justice Department. So there is Jack Anderson tampering with something in Washington that could be really serious. And I want to just conclude. We got about 3 more minutes, and every week I want to talk about the death penalty. because McCabe had an article in the Chronicle this week about Ethel Younger and Ronald Reagan. The elections in November, every week spread word out about the ballot, Proposition 17, the death penalty, vote no. McCabe had a column about the dreadful and inhuman charade of capital punishment up in San Quentin. And he says, Governor Reagan and Attorney General Younger have their way. They will lead the public to approve the death penalty and restore it. He also said that Attorney General Younger and Governor Reagan are self-proclaimed friends of the victim, friends of the gas chamber. McCabe said, I can only believe that Mr. Reagan is so anxious to be elected president of the United States in '76, and Mr. Younger so badly wants to be our next governor that they are willing cold-bloodedly to get the voters to believe that you'll control violence if you vote about this death penalty. It's a shame. It said this is Reagan's shame and Younger's shame, and it must be California's shame. And McCabe gave illustrations of where the death penalty helps people do murders. He gave 5 examples of people who wanted to die and committed the crime so that the state would take care of them. And I have a list of patsies that are political patsies up at San Quentin, like Charles Manson, John Frazier, Sirhan, Hugo Pinnell, and 4 men on death row that Tack would frame while he worked for the LAPD to get them up on death row. So every week I want to say work hard and make the point, not only is it cruel and inhuman, but the 2 men who are defendants, well, Younger is a defendant, and they sued for hiding the truth about who killed Robert Kennedy, and he wants Sirhan to get the death penalty. That's been changed now. Recently it was committed that he couldn't get the death penalty, but one of the big problems is if you get your political patsies in jail and quickly say all the evidence leads that they did it, you could kill them and never get the truth, like you killed Lee Harvey Oswald in jail. The death penalty is a treacherous thing, and call attention to it and tell your friends, if you listen to Dialogue Conspiracy, that innocent men are taking the rap for the real assassins. And everyone should be allowed to live, but the men who have some foreknowledge of this assassination are covering it up, want the death penalty.
I think before we leave that I should mention that we're obligated under FCC regulations to offer equal time for the yes on 17. So if anybody's listening and feels that their position has been weakened by Mae's arguments against the death penalty initiative, please contact the station and we'll try and arrange some equal time for you to express your viewpoints.
Okay, let's say the whole program was on the death penalty. They get 2 minutes, because that's all I did. They don't get the whole hour, right?
Okay.
Okay.
It's number 78 in an ongoing series of Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell. This has been